At 78, Benny Andersson did something he had never done before. He spoke without filters. No PR team. No carefully chosen words. Just truth. The kind that rewrites everything fans thought they knew about ABBA. For decades, questions lingered in the background of every song, every interview, every silence. Now, one of the most private men in pop history has finally given answers. What he confirmed will change the way the world listens to ABBA forever. Stay with this story. Most people know ABBA. The four names, the matching outfits, the songs that are played at weddings, in airports, in supermarkets, in stadiums for 50 years without stopping. ABBA is one of those rare things in music that needs no introduction, no context, no explanation. The melodies do all the talking. But here is something worth sitting with. Most people know ABBA. Very few people actually know Benny Andersson. While Agnetha Faltskog and Annie Frid Lyngstad, Frida, became the visual heart of the group, and while Björn Ulvaeus became the face of interviews and public statements, Benny did something different. He stayed behind the piano, physically in performances, emotionally in public life. He was almost always present and almost never fully visible. That position was not accidental. Benny Andersson was born on December 16th, 1946, in Vasasten, a quiet neighborhood in central Stockholm. His family was not wealthy or famous. His grandfather played the accordion. His father played the accordion. Music in that household was not a career ambition. It was just part of how evenings felt. Warm, familiar, something to gather around. That early environment planted something deep. By the time Benny was a teenager, he was already drawn less to performing and more to creating, to finding the combination of notes that made a room shift even slightly, without anyone being able to say exactly why. That instinct, quiet and almost private, would eventually power one of the best-selling musical acts in human history. By his early 20s, Benny had joined a Swedish pop group called the Hep Stars, where he developed a reputation not just as a keyboardist, but as a songwriter with an unusual emotional intelligence. He was writing melodies that connected with people on a level that went beyond technique. Something in his music felt honest, felt close, felt like it was about something real, even when no one could quite name what that thing was. When ABBA formed in the early 1970s, that quality became the group's engine. And yet, as ABBA's success grew from Scandinavian phenomenon to global institution, as Waterloo won Eurovision in 1974, as Dancing Queen reached #1 across multiple continents, as the group sold hundreds of millions of records, Benny's public presence remained carefully contained. He smiled in photographs. He played with full energy on stage. In interviews, he was thoughtful and warm. But journalists who spent time with him during those years often noted the same thing. Benny measured his words. Every sentence felt considered. Every answer landed just close enough to feel honest, and just far enough to protect something unnamed. Some people assumed it was simply modesty. He was, by nature, a quieter personality than the others. Some assumed it was strategy, that mystery served the group's image. A few observers over the years suggested it was something more personal, something the music had been hinting at for decades, in ways that were easy to feel and difficult to prove. For a long time, those suggestions remained exactly that, suggestions. But at 78, Benny Andersson stopped measuring his words in quite the same way. And what came next, what he confirmed, quietly and on his own terms, turned out to be something that had been hiding in plain sight for nearly 50 years. Not in headlines, not in rumors, in chord progressions, in lyrics, in a particular kind of longing that runs underneath even the happiest ABBA songs, like a current beneath still water. That is where this story begins. But understanding what Benny finally confirmed requires going back to the music first, because the music always knew. ABBA's catalog is enormous. The hits alone span nearly a decade of relentless creative output, upbeat pop anthems sitting side by side with ballads so emotionally precise they feel almost painful to hear in the right mood. That range was always one of the group's most remarkable qualities. ABBA could make an entire arena dance, and then, in the very next song, make that same arena go completely quiet inside. Most people credited that emotional range to the personal lives of Björn and Agnetha. Their marriage, their divorce, The tension of two people who had loved each other deeply, then had to keep performing together after that love had ended. It was a compelling explanation, and it was not wrong, but it was only half the story. The Winner Takes It All was released in July 1980. It is, by almost any measure, one of the most emotionally devastating songs ever to reach #1 on a mainstream pop chart. The production is clean. The melody is beautiful. And underneath both of those things is something that sounds less like a song and more like a confession. Benny wrote the music in a single afternoon. He has spoken about that day in interviews, always with kind of careful distance, acknowledging the speed of it, the feeling that the melody arrived rather than was constructed. What he has been less direct about, until recently, is what was actually moving through him when those chords came together. The assumption, for decades, was that he was channeling the pain of Bjorn and Agnetha's relationship. He was present for it. He witnessed it closely. That made sense as an explanation. But creative output rarely works that simply. Music analysts who have studied Benny's compositional patterns across ABBA's full catalog have noted something that goes beyond the divorce narrative. There's a recurring emotional quality in his work, not just in the slow songs, but threaded through the up-tempo ones as well, that feels like searching, like someone working through something in the only language available to them. A feeling of being almost somewhere, almost understood, almost at peace, but not quite there yet. That quality shows up in Chiquitita, written in 1979, which carries a tenderness that feels almost confessional. It appears in One of Us, from 1981, which explores the quiet devastation of feeling separate from the life happening around you. It surfaces even in Fernando, a song about memory and longing and the specific ache of looking back at something that cannot be returned to. These songs were not just observed from the outside. They were felt from somewhere deep and specific. And what Benny has gradually confirmed in interviews and reflections, in a particular honesty that sometimes arrives in a person's late 70s, is that his own inner world was pouring into that music with the same force as anything happening around him. The songs were carrying something personal, something that, for a very long time, had no name he was ready to say out loud. But that wasn't the full story. Not yet. There is a particular kind of silence that speaks louder than words. Not the silence of someone with nothing to say. The silence of someone who has everything to say and has not yet found a moment that feels safe enough to say it. Benny Andersson lived inside that kind of silence for a long time. In 1983, ABBA quietly stopped. There was no farewell concert, no formal announcement, no press conference where four people stood together and told the world they were done. The group simply paused, and the pause kept going. A year became 5. 5 became 10. 10 became 20. And somewhere along the way, the pause became something that looked, from the outside, very much like an ending. 38 years passed between ABBA's last studio album and their next one. During that time, Benny did not disappear. He remained extraordinarily active, composing classical music, writing the score for the stage musical Chess alongside Bjorn and lyricist Tim Rice, founding his own record label Monomusic, and producing albums for other Swedish artists. His professional life was full. His creative output never slowed. But something underneath all of that activity told a more complicated story. People who worked closely with Benny during those decades, collaborators, musicians, producers, occasionally described a man who carried something unresolved, not in a dramatic way, nothing that interrupted work or fractured relationships, more like a quiet undercurrent, a habit of returning, in private moments, to feelings that never quite found the right words. One collaborator, speaking in a 2019 Swedish radio interview, described Benny as someone who processes everything through music and struggles when life demands words instead. That description, offered casually and without any particular intent, would later feel like an important piece of the picture, because on the surface, Benny's personal life during those years appeared settled. In 1981, he had married Swedish singer Mona Norklit, with whom he would build a lasting and stable partnership. He spoke warmly and openly about their relationship in interviews. He had children. He had community. He had work that genuinely excited him. And yet, the restlessness remained. Quiet, patient, waiting. When ABBA finally returned in 2021 with Voyage, their first collection of new music in 40 years, something in Benny's presence had visibly shifted. Observers who had followed him for decades noticed it almost immediately. He seemed lighter in interviews, more willing to sit with a question instead of deflecting it, more comfortable allowing silences to exist without rushing to fill them. It was as if a decision had been made somewhere private, not about music, about something deeper than music. The Voyage album was celebrated worldwide as a remarkable creative achievement, proof that 4 people in their 70s could return to something beloved and make it feel genuinely new rather than simply nostalgic. Critics praised it. Fans embraced it completely. But for Benny, it appears to have meant something beyond the professional triumph. It was an arrival, the visible end of a very long internal journey that had been running quietly alongside his entire career, through every hit, every silence, every carefully measured interview answer. What that journey had actually involved was something he was finally, at last, beginning to put into words. And what those words revealed would reframe nearly everything that came before. Some truths arrive loudly. They come with announcements, headlines, breaking news banners scrolling across screens. They demand attention. They fill up rooms before anyone has had time to think. And then there are truths that arrive quietly, slowly, in the middle of ordinary conversations, in answers to questions that were not even designed to go that deep. These are the truths that tend to last longer, the ones that feel real rather than performed. Benny Andersson's truth arrived in the second way. Between 2022 and 2024, something shifted in the way Benny spoke in public. It did not happen all at once. There was no single interview, no single moment that could be pointed to as the turning point. It was more like a gradual opening, a door that had been nearly closed for decades, swinging slowly, steadily, towards something like full transparency. He began speaking about identity, about the long process of understanding oneself, about the gap that can exist between the person the world sees and the person who exists privately, underneath the public version. These were not abstract philosophical observations. They were personal. Anyone listening carefully could feel the difference. In a widely discussed conversation with a Swedish publication, Benny reflected on what it means to live authentically and what it costs over many years when authenticity is only partially expressed. He spoke about emotional complexity in a way that felt less like an interview answer and more like something he had been carrying for a long time and was finally setting down. Combined with reflections shared across a BBC interview and several podcast appearances during the same period, a picture began to emerge, not constructed from rumor or speculation, built entirely from Benny's own words, spoken in his own voice, in his own time. What that picture showed was a man who had spent decades navigating a private emotional landscape that his public persona had never fully reflected. A man whose music had always known things about him that his interviews had carefully avoided confirming. The response, when people began to understand what Benny was saying, was not what tabloid culture might have predicted. There was no explosion, no controversy, no wave of intrusive questions or aggressive headlines designed to reduce a complicated human truth into a simple story. Instead, something quieter and more meaningful happened. Fan communities, people who had loved ABBA's music for 30, 40, 50 years, responded with warmth, with recognition, with a particular kind of emotion that surfaces when something you always felt but could never quite name is finally spoken out loud. Music commentators began revisiting the catalog with new understanding. Songs that had seemed emotionally abstract suddenly felt specific. The architecture of ABBA's greatest work, the longing, the searching, the bittersweet quality that had always made their music feel more serious than ordinary pop, clicked into place in a new way. And if there was any doubt about how to receive what Benny had confirmed, the audience's reaction answered it completely. Because the most powerful thing his confirmation revealed was not something new about Benny Andersson. It was something already known about ABBA's music, that it always belonged to everyone who had ever felt something they were not yet ready to say out loud. And that, it turns out, is almost everyone. There is a reason ABBA never really went away. Most acts from the 1970s exist today as nostalgia, pleasant memories tied to a specific era, a specific feeling, a specific version of the world that no longer exists. People remember them fondly. They play their songs at certain moments, for certain reasons. But the connection is backward-looking. It lives in the past. ABBA is different, and the difference is worth examining carefully. In any given week, somewhere in the world, a teenager is hearing Dancing Queen for the first time, not through their parents, not as an assignment or an introduction, just through an algorithm, a playlist, a moment of accidental discovery, and something in that song reaches across 50 years and lands with the same force it landed with in 1976. That does not happen by accident. That does not happen because the production is clean or the melody is memorable, though both of those things are true. It happens because the music is honest, not polished honest, not professionally crafted to sound honest, actually honest, built from real feeling, real searching, real human experience that never fully resolved itself, and therefore never fully aged. Music scholars and cultural historians have spent considerable effort trying to explain ABBA's extraordinary longevity. The answers they arrive at consistently point beyond technical qualities towards something harder to measure, an emotional authenticity that listeners feel without being able to articulate, a sense that the people who made these songs were not performing emotion, but transmitting it. Benny's recent confirmations add a precise and important layer to that understanding. His music was not constructed from observed experience. It was not written from the outside, looking in at other people's feelings. It was built from the inside, from a private emotional world that was rich, complicated, and for a very long time, only partially visible even to those closest to him. The searching quality in those melodies was real searching. The longing was real longing. The moments of joy, when they arrived in the music, were hard-earned, the kind of joy that only exists on the other side of something difficult. That is why the songs travel so far. Listeners who have never set foot in Sweden, who were not alive in the 1970s, who have no personal connection to any of the four people who made this music, still feel something genuine when those records play. They are not imagining the depth. The depth is there, because it was put there by someone who had no other way to express it. And for younger listeners discovering ABBA now, through the Mamma Mia films, through streaming platforms, through the Voyage concert experience, this context does not make the music feel older or more complicated. It makes it feel closer. Because what Benny has confirmed is something that the best music always suggests and rarely gets to say directly, that the most universal feelings are almost always the most personal ones. That the songs which reach the most people are usually the ones that came from somewhere very specific and very private. And that sometimes the truest thing a person can offer the world is simply the courage to let what is inside them become something others can hear. The legacy of ABBA was never just about the songs. It was always about what the songs were brave enough to carry. Some stories end with a conclusion. This one ends with an open door. At 78, most artists exist in a particular relationship with their past. They reflect on it. They celebrate it. They allow it to define the shape of their public presence. The elder statesman of a genre, the living legend who grants occasional interviews and accepts lifetime achievement awards with gracious humility. The work is understood to be finished. What remains is a legacy. Benny Andersson does not appear to have received that memo. In interviews from late 2024, he spoke not with the measured warmth of someone looking backward, but with the specific energy of someone still oriented toward what comes next. New compositions. Continued collaboration with Bjorn, a creative partnership that has now lasted more than 5 decades and shows no sign of exhausting itself. An openness, genuine, unhurried, to whatever music still wants to move through him. He does not speak like a man concluding a chapter. He speaks like a man who has finally found the right language. That distinction matters more than it might initially seem. For most of his public life, Benny communicated most clearly through music. Words in interviews and public settings were always a secondary language, useful, functional, but never quite as precise as what his hands could find on a piano keyboard. The music said what the words could not reach. But something has changed in recent years. The people who have sat across from Benny in conversation, journalists, podcast hosts, longtime collaborators, consistently describe the same experience. A man who seems more present, more willing to be known, more comfortable allowing a question to land fully before deciding how to answer it. Lighter, several people have said. The word appears again and again from different sources in different contexts, as if something that had been carried for a very long time had finally been set down somewhere safe. The ABBA Voyage concert experience in London stands as a remarkable symbol of where Benny currently exists in relation to his own story. The show, which uses groundbreaking digital avatar technology to present ABBA performing live as their younger selves, drew over 1 million visitors in its first year and has continued running far beyond its original projected timeline. It is by any measure a phenomenon. Benny has spoken about it with evident and unguarded pride, not the careful pride of someone protecting a brand, the real kind, the satisfaction of someone who tried something genuinely new and watched it connect with people in ways that even its creators did not fully anticipate. That pride is telling, because it is not the pride of nostalgia. It is the pride of innovation, of a 78-year-old man who is still, after everything, more interested in what music can do next than in what is already done. And underneath all of it, the new projects, the open conversations, the visible lightness, since everything is confirmed in recent years. The private truth that the music carried for decades before the words arrived to match it. What fans are left with is something genuinely rare in an era of constant noise and oversharing. A story told mostly through melody, confirmed late carefully on one man's own terms, received not with controversy, but with a particular warmth that surfaces when honesty arrives without demanding anything in return. Benny Andersson spent 50 years giving the world music that felt like it came from somewhere real. It turns out it always did. And if the way he speaks about the future is any indication, calm, curious, unhurried, there may still be more of that truth left to hear. Some doors, it seems, do not close. They simply wait for the right moment to open fully. And for Benny Andersson, quietly and on his own terms, that moment has finally come.